By 7 on Friday evening, the rodeo grounds outside Harding Ridge were packed. Horse trailers filled the gravel lot. Sponsor banners hung from the arena rails. Smoke rolled off the barbecue pits, and a country band was already working through its first set. Brad Harding had been there less than 20 minutes when one woman asked him to dance, another handed him a beer, and a third pulled him toward her father for an introduction he clearly had not requested. Brad thanked all three, escaped without embarrassing anyone, and found Wes Calder leaning against the arena gate with a grin. "Half the county is trying to marry you." Brad tipped his hat back. "I feel like a breeding bull with a bank account." Wes laughed. "Your father should put you in the catalog. He would charge too much." Brad was used to being watched. Harding Ridge was one of the largest cattle and quarter-horse operations in the county, and his father, Sam, had spent 3 decades turning the ranch into a business everyone around the rodeo circuit recognized. Brad had money, land, and a last name people liked to discuss as if it belonged partly to them. He had dated women. He had dated men. That was never the problem. The problem was how quickly people stopped seeing Brad and started seeing Harding. He noticed Gabe because Gabe did not look at him at all. The server moved through the crowd with a tray balanced on one hand and a leather apron tied over dark jeans. He caught a drop meal ticket before the wind took it, helped a teenage ranch hand clean up a spilled soda without making him feel stupid, and quietly redirected a drunk guest toward the water station. No performance. No fake smile. Brad watched him longer than he meant to. "Found something interesting?" Wes asked. "Maybe. That sounds expensive." Brad ignored him and crossed toward the coffee station. "Can I get one of those?" Brad asked. Gabe looked past him at the beer garden. "Coffee? I'm driving." "You own the ranch next door." "Still driving." Gabe reached for a cup. "Black. Little cream. Sugar?" "Depends." "Is the coffee bad?" That finally made Gabe look directly at him. "There are 3 bars here. None of them have you." Gabe stared at him for a beat. "That sounded smoother in your head, didn't it?" Brad laughed. "Much." "Good. I'd hate to think that was the finished version." Gabe handed him the coffee. Their fingers brushed for barely a second. "Sponsors drink free. That feels unfair to paying customers. Take it up with management." "You are management." "I'm carrying a tray, Mr. Harding. Aim higher." Gabe picked up the next order and moved away before Brad could answer. The second time Brad got close to him, somebody backed into Gabe and knocked his tray sideways. Brad caught one edge before the glasses went down. For a second, both men held the same tray, hands only inches apart. Gabe's eyes met his, and something changed in the space between them. Not much. Just enough. Gabe recovered first. "Thanks. No problem. You can let go now." Brad looked down. He was still holding the tray. Right. Strong start. Later, Brad saw Gabe lifting a crate of bottled water beside the catering tent. "Need a hand?" "No, that thing's heavy. So are cows." "You still move those yourself, don't you?" "Sometimes." "Then we both have jobs." Gabe shifted the crate against his hip. When Brad reached for the other side anyway, Gabe stopped him with a look. "You're one of the sponsors. I'm one of the servers. Let me finish my shift without everybody deciding why you're helping me." Brad let his hands fall. Gabe seemed ready for an argument. He did not get one. "Fair. That's it. You said no." "I did. So I'll listen." For the first time, Gabe lost the dry expression he had been wearing all night. Someone called him from the truck, and he walked away with the crate. Brad did not follow. Near midnight, he saw Gabe again without the apron, standing at the back rail in a denim overshirt while the last riders practiced in the arena. Brad started toward him, remembered the boundary Gabe had drawn around his work, and turned toward the parking lot instead. Gabe noticed that too. The next morning, Brad was on the ground beside the youth arena with a wrench in one hand and dust all over his jeans. A bent panel needed straightening before the junior events began. Wes held the fence steady and complained about working before breakfast until a familiar voice came from behind them. "I brought proof that volunteers deserve better management." Gabe pushed a small cart loaded with coffee containers and breakfast boxes through the gate. No apron. No badge. Just a gray t-shirt, faded jeans, and sunglasses on his head. Wes abandoned the fence immediately. I like him already. You like anyone carrying food, Brat said. That doesn't make me wrong. Gabe passed Brat a breakfast sandwich. Brat took a bite and looked at him. You made this? I did. Needs more bacon. You own cattle. Your opinion on meat is financially compromised. Brat laughed around another bite. That's not how conflict of interest works. It is at breakfast. They spent the next hour working within easy reach of each other. Gabe poured coffee, helped tape signs to the rails, and eventually held a panel while Brat tightened a hinge. Without the sponsor crowd around them, conversation came easier. Gabe watched Brat kneeling in the dust with grease on his hands and said, "You're less impressive like this." Brat glanced up. "Should I be offended? No. I like you better." The words slipped out before Gabe could stop them. He looked away and reached for another roll of tape. Brat did not tease him. That restraint made the silence between them warmer, not awkward. When the volunteers finally took a break, Gabe opened a second box and handed out smaller sandwiches. Brat noticed the labels written in marker: smoked beef and egg, green chili chicken, vegetarian potato. Testing recipes? Gabe nodded. I want to open a mobile breakfast and coffee trailer. Rodeos, horse shows, livestock auctions. Places where everybody wants food at 6 in the morning and nobody wants to cook it. That's actually smart. Try not to sound surprised. I'm recovering from the bacon insult. Gabe smiled, then grew more serious. The commercial kitchen he rented cheaply was changing owners after rodeo season. If he could not prove the trailer could support itself before then, he would have to postpone the whole plan for another year. Brat's first instinct was to ask how much money Gabe needed. He felt the question forming and remembered the crate from the night before. Instead, he lifted the sandwich. What are you calling this one? Gabe studied him for a moment, clearly aware of the question Brat had chosen not to ask. The Sunrise. Still needs bacon. Get off my fence. By the time Gabe packed the empty coffee containers, Brat knew two things he had not known the night before. Gabe Wallace was not indifferent to him, and Gabe had a life he was building that had nothing to do with the Harding name. Both facts made Brat more interested, not less. Wes waited until Gabe's truck had pulled out before saying, "You're staring." "I'm thinking." "No, you're staring." Brat threw a work glove at him and went back to the fence. Over the next 2 weeks, Brat found several legitimate reasons to stop at the coffee counter where Gabe worked between rodeo events and at least twice as many reasons that were not legitimate at all. Sometimes they talked for 10 minutes. Sometimes Gabe was busy and Brat drank his coffee without demanding attention. That mattered more than Brat realized. Gabe had spent years serving people who treated friendliness as part of the price they paid. Brat learned quickly that if Gabe said he was working, he meant exactly that. Their conversations became a running argument about coffee, horses, and breakfast. Gabe accused Brat of ruining espresso with sugar. Brat accused Gabe of designing sandwiches for people with no respect for bacon. One afternoon, Gabe asked what Brat actually did at Harding Ridge besides appear in sponsor photographs. Brat took enough offense to invite him to see for himself. A few days later, Gabe came to the ranch with his catering manager to inspect the setup for a charity rodeo. When the manager left, Brat found Gabe near the parking lot. "You have 20 minutes? For what?" "To discover I do occasionally work." Gabe followed him toward the training barn. It was not the polished barn sponsors toured. The paint was worn near the doors, tack hung from old hooks, and one stall still had teeth marks on the top rail from a mare Brat had trained years ago. A calm bay quarter horse leaned its head over the gate when Brat approached. Gabe reached toward it, hesitated, then looked at Brat. "If this animal bites me, I'm suing. You can't afford my lawyers." "Exactly. I'll take the ranch." Brat stepped behind him and guided his hand toward the horse's neck. Gabe went still at the closeness. Brat's chest almost touched his back. Neither man needed help understanding why the air felt different. Gabe turned his head. Brat's eyes dropped briefly to his mouth. For a second, a kiss seemed inevitable. Then the horse shoved its nose between them looking for carrots. Gabe burst out laughing. "Saved by your employee. She's union." They stayed in the barn longer than 20 minutes. Sitting on the edge of an empty stall, Brad admitted that dating was easy until people decided what the Harding name meant to them. Some wanted the lifestyle. Others worked so hard to prove they did not care about the money that every dinner became a test. Sometimes I can't tell if someone likes me or the version of me they built before we met. Gabe rolled a carrot between his palms. Maybe let somebody meet Brat before you introduce them to Harding. Brat looked at him. Gabe did not soften the statement or turn it into a joke. That was the first time Brat understood why Gabe's opinion mattered so much to him. Gabe was not impressed by the ranch, but he was interested in the man showing it to him. The proof came a week later at a smaller rodeo. Gabe was closing a temporary coffee booth when he heard a woman near the neighboring trailer call Brat's name. She was a barrel racer Brat had known for years, confident and easy with him. Gabe had no reason to listen, which did not stop him. "You're seriously turning down a drink with me?" she asked. Brat smiled. "I am. Since when?" "I'm seeing someone." The woman lifted an eyebrow. "Serious?" Brat paused. Gabe kept his back turned, suddenly very interested in stacking paper cups. "Getting there," Brat said. There was no audience he cared about. Brat did not know Gabe could hear him. That made the answer land harder than any public flirtation could have. Gabe finished closing the booth with a smile he tried and failed to hide. The first real fight came from exactly the part of Brat that Gabe had been watching carefully. The refrigeration unit at the commercial kitchen Gabe used failed 2 days before a busy weekend. Gabe mentioned it during a rushed phone call, mostly because he had to cancel dinner. By the time he reached the kitchen that afternoon, a local equipment supplier had already called him about a replacement unit. Gabe stared at the number on his phone, then called Brat. "What did you do?" There was a pause. "I called someone I know." "You arranged a refrigerator?" "I found one." "You needed it." "I needed time to figure out my options." "I was trying to save you the problem." "That's exactly what I didn't ask you to do." Brat arrived 20 minutes later and found Gabe outside the kitchen loading coolers into his truck. "I didn't buy anything," Brat said. "You called the supplier before you asked me. Because your weekend was about to get wrecked." Gabe shut the tailgate harder than necessary. "You hear a problem and immediately decide it belongs to you." "I was helping." "No. You decided what help was supposed to look like." Gabe faced him fully. "If this becomes something real, I need to know I'm your boyfriend someday, not another Harding project." Brat opened his mouth and stopped. Gabe was angry, but he was not wrong. That made defending himself feel useless. They did not speak for 3 days. It was not a dramatic breakup because there was nothing official to break yet. Brat simply stopped appearing at Gabe's counter, and Gabe noticed the absence more than he wanted to. Wes noticed Brat's mood by lunch on the first day. "You screw it up?" "I tried to help him." Wes chewed slowly. "That sentence has killed a lot of relationships." "I found a refrigerator." "Did he ask for one?" "He needed one." "That wasn't my question." Wes pushed his plate away. "Stop solving him. Try listening." Brat canceled the supplier arrangement himself. Then he went to Gabe without flowers, gifts, or another solution. Gabe was loading coffee into his truck when Brat stopped several feet away. "I treated your problem like it belonged to me." Gabe looked at him. "It doesn't." "I know." Brat put his hands in his pockets to keep from reaching for him. "If you ask for help, I'll show up. If you don't, I'll keep my hands off it." "You make that sound painful." "It probably will be." Gabe's mouth twitched. "At least you're honest." That evening they finished a charity rodeo planning meeting after everyone else had left. The arena lights were shutting down one row at a time when Brat and Gabe ended up sitting on the open tailgate of Brat's pickup. For once there was no work left to hide behind. "You were easier when I thought you were just flirting," Gabe said. "What changed?" Gabe looked toward the dark arena. "You stopped feeling temporary." Brat turned toward him. "Is that a reason to stop?" No, neither moved for a second. Then Gabe leaned in first. Brat met him halfway. The kiss started careful and quickly became warmer, Gabe's hand catching the front of Brat's shirt while Brat held his waist. When they separated, both were breathing harder than the kiss should have justified. Brat smiled. "Still think I'm easier when I'm flirting?" "Shut up." Gabe kissed him again. A sprinkler kicked on behind the arena fence and sprayed the side of the pickup. Gabe jerked back as cold water hit his shoulder. Brat laughed so hard he nearly slid off the tailgate. Gabe shoved him, then started laughing too. By the time they climbed into the truck, nothing between them had been formally defined, but neither man was pretending anymore. Dating Brat turned out to be less glamorous than Gabe had expected and more fun than he wanted to admit. Brat showed up at 6 in the morning to test breakfast sandwiches before moving cattle. Gabe stood by the arena rail and watched him work a nervous young horse until the animal stopped fighting the bit. Brat helped close the coffee booth after 2 long events and learned, after dropping a sleeve of lids across the floor, that Gabe did not believe wealth excused clumsiness. They argued over the radio in Brat's pickup. Gabe discovered Brat talked to horses in a soft voice he would have denied using with anyone else. Brat discovered Gabe could fall asleep sitting upright after a 14-hour event and still wake up defensive about it. One Sunday, Gabe spent most of the day at Harding Ridge without a catering contract, giving him a reason to be there. They ate lunch with Wes and 2 ranch hands, walked through the breeding barn, and ended up on the back porch while Sam Harding repaired a leather bridle nearby. Sam watched his son laugh at something Gabe said and waited until Gabe had gone inside for coffee before speaking. "You like him," Sam said. Brat glanced over. "That obvious? To anybody with eyes." Sam pulled the leather through the buckle. "Then make sure you're making room for him." "What does that mean?" "It means this ranch is big enough to swallow people. So is your name." Sam looked at him. "Are you making room for Gabe in your life, or waiting for him to fit inside the one you already built?" Brat did not have a quick answer. Sam went back to the bridle. "That's what I thought." The question stayed with Brat when the Regional Rodeo Association opened applications for its preferred food vendor program. The winning vendor would receive guaranteed event slots for the next season. For Gabe, it was the difference between a business plan and an actual business. The contract would give him enough predictable income to lease another commercial kitchen when his current agreement ended. Gabe read the application twice before saying anything to Brat. Then he drove to the ranch and found him repairing an irrigation line. Harding Ridge gets a vote on the vendor program. Brat wiped his hands on a rag. "Usually, if you're judging, I'm not applying." Brat's expression tightened. "You think I'd rig it?" "No. I think even if you didn't, I'd spend the next year wondering if everybody else thought you did." "That's not the same thing. It matters to me." A few months earlier, Brat would have argued until Gabe understood his intentions. This time he looked at him for a long second and nodded. "Okay." The next morning, Brat emailed the committee and formally removed himself from the selection process. The entries would be scored through a blind tasting, an operations review, and a final live service test during Harding Heritage Rodeo Night. When Gabe heard Brat had stepped down without trying to negotiate some middle ground, he called him immediately. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did. I could have skipped it. And then you'd be changing your plan because of me." Brat leaned against the barn door. "That doesn't sound like making room." Gabe went quiet. "Your father got to you. He usually does eventually." Gabe made the finalist list. 2 weeks before the final event, he ran a practice service from a borrowed trailer at a local horse show. 50 customers arrived in less than 20 minutes, and one of his helpers called in sick. Gabe worked the register, poured coffee, assembled sandwiches, and tried to convince himself the growing line was manageable. Brat appeared at the side window in work clothes. "Need anything? I can handle it." "I know." Brat stayed outside. Gabe looked at the line, looked at the grill, then looked back at him. "Can you pour coffee?" Brat grinned. "Finally. A job I'm qualified for. That's still under review." Brat washed his hands, tied on an apron, and took the drink station. He was not fast, but he listened. When Gabe told him to stop overfilling cups, he stopped. When Gabe changed the order system, Brat followed it without asking why. Within 15 minutes, the line shortened. Wes arrived just in time to see Brat Harding in an apron handing out drip coffee. He raised his phone. "Don't," Brat warned. "Christmas card. I will fire you. You've been threatening that for 11 years. Gabe laughed so hard he had to turn away from the grill. That night, after the trailer was cleaned and the equipment packed, Gabe sat with Brat at the ranch kitchen table. He had made the final 2 vendors. The old version of Brat would have wanted to celebrate by buying something. The current version opened 2 beers and waited until Gabe brought the subject up. "You could have made all of this easier," Gabe said. "You didn't ask me to." Gabe looked at him over the bottle. That's the point. Brat reached across the table, palm up. Gabe put his hand in it. The kiss that followed was not their first, but it carried more weight than the one on the tailgate. There was no uncertainty left about whether they wanted each other. Gabe pulled Brat closer, and Brat stopped only long enough to make sure the answer in Gabe's face matched the one in his hands. They went upstairs together and closed the bedroom door behind them. What followed stayed private. A night of mutual trust, heat, and finally letting go of the restraint they had carried for weeks. Brat never rushed Gabe, and Gabe never had to wonder whether he was being handled like another problem to solve. By the time the room went quiet, both men understood that the relationship had moved beyond casual dating. For the full and censored 18+ raw scene with all steamy details, see the Patreon version through the link in the video description. The next morning, Gabe woke to the smell of something burning. He found Brat in the kitchen staring at a frying pan with the grim concentration of a man facing hostile machinery. The eggs were ruined. The toast was worse. The coffee somehow was fine. Gabe leaned against the doorway. You run a multi-million-dollar ranch. Brat pointed at the stove. Cows don't require a frying pan. You're feeding me cereal. I can cut fruit. That sounds dangerous too. Brat crossed the kitchen and kissed him, quick and easy. Gabe caught his wrist before he could move away and kissed him again. There was something different in the simplicity of it. No question about whether Brat would still be there in the morning. No need for Gabe to pretend he was already planning his exit. The only tension left between them before Harding Heritage Rodeo Night came from the event itself. Gabe's live service final would happen during the busiest hour of the evening. Brat also had a traditional role. For years, a Harding representative had opened the after-rodeo Western two-step with a partner. The choice had become a local guessing game, especially because half the community still treated Brat's dating life as public entertainment. Gabe brought it up while they were loading supplies into the borrowed trailer. Don't turn us into some giant public gesture. Brat shut the tailgate. I'm not planning a speech. That is not reassuring. I don't need to prove anything. Then what are you doing? Brat looked at him, choosing. Gabe held his gaze, then shook his head and returned to the checklist. He trusted Brat more than he had a month earlier. He also knew Brat well enough to understand that one-word answer meant the conversation was not finished. Harding Heritage Rodeo Night arrived with every parking field full before sunset. The final bull riding round drew the biggest crowd of the season, and the vendor lane stayed busy from the moment the gates opened. Gabe's borrowed trailer sat between a barbecue truck and a dessert stand, its menu board cut down to the items that had scored best during testing. The judges were somewhere in the crowd, anonymous to the finalists. Brat was nowhere near the booth. He had promised not to interfere, and Gabe knew he meant it. For the first hour, service ran cleanly. Then the line doubled. One espresso unit began taking nearly twice as long to cycle, and a stack of orders started building beside the register. Gabe looked at the board, calculated what each slow item was costing them, and made the decision before panic had time to settle in. Pull the 2 specialty drinks, he told his assistant. Drip coffee, cold brew, and the standard latte only. Cross off the loaded potatoes too. Keep the 3 sandwiches. We're cutting menu items during judging. We're serving people during judging. Gabe took the marker himself and changed the board. Fast and good beats ambitious and late. The next 20 minutes were hard, but the line moved. Gabe shifted one worker from assembly to register, took the front counter himself, and stopped apologizing for the reduced menu. Customers got hot food and drinks before they became impatient. By the time the rush eased, the order rail was clear. Gabe finally looked beyond the line and saw Brat standing across the lane beside the arena fence. He had been watching but had not stepped in. Their eyes met. Brat raised his coffee cup once, like a private toast. Gabe smiled and turned back to work. That simple gesture mattered. Brat had finally learned when Gabe needed him close and when Gabe needed room to prove something to himself. The rodeo ended just after 9. Music started under the covered pavilion while the arena crew cleared equipment from the dirt. Gabe was still wiping down the counter when his catering manager came by and looked at him. You're done. I still have inventory. Tomorrow. She pointed at his apron. Take that thing off and go enjoy the party before you start charging yourself overtime." Gabe laughed, shut the trailer window, and changed in the small back room. He traded the apron and work shirt for dark jeans and a clean Western shirt he had brought mostly because Brad had told him to. When he stepped into the pavilion, the band was warming up for the opening two-step. Brad stood near the center aisle talking to Sam and Wes. Gabe saw one woman approach him, say something with a smile, and offer her hand toward the dance floor. Brad smiled back and shook his head. A second woman tried a minute later. Same result. Wes noticed Gabe at the back of the pavilion and said something into Brad's ear. Brad turned. The room was crowded enough that Gabe could have looked away and disappeared behind another group. He stayed where he was. The announcer stepped to the microphone. "All right, folks. You know the tradition. We're opening this floor with a Harding two-step." People cheered. Brad did not head toward any of the women waiting near the center. He crossed the pavilion instead. Gabe's pulse kicked harder as Brad came closer. He had told Brad not to make them into a statement. Brad did not climb onto a stage. He did not take a microphone. He did not call for attention. He simply stopped in front of Gabe, as if the rest of the room were background noise. "Still working?" Brad asked. Gabe glanced at his clean shirt. "No, good." Brad held out his hand. "Dance with me." Gabe looked at the hand, then at him. Brad waited. He did not reach farther or make the choice for him. "Only if you want to," Brad said quietly. That was what settled it. Gabe put his hand in Brad's. The band started before they reached the middle of the floor. Brad's hand came to Gabe's waist, and Gabe rested one hand on his shoulder. Neither was a perfect dancer. Brad was better, mostly because ranch weddings and rodeo parties had forced him to learn. Gabe stepped on his boot once in the first 30 seconds. "You did that on purpose," Brad said. "Prove it." Gabe could feel people watching, but nobody around them turned the moment into a scandal. Some were surprised because the entire town had spent years guessing which woman Brad Harding might eventually settle down with. Others smiled because they had already seen enough of Brad and Gabe together to understand exactly what was happening. Sam stood near the edge of the floor with his arms folded and an expression that looked suspiciously satisfied. "Everyone's watching," Gabe murmured. "They've watched me my whole life. That doesn't bother you?" Brad looked at him instead of the crowd. "I'd rather they finally watch me choose something for myself." Gabe's hand tightened slightly on his shoulder. That was the point of the dance. Not that Brad had chosen a man. Not that Gabe had once served drinks at the same event. Brad had spent years being offered partners as if marriage were another ranch decision everyone could help make. Gabe had spent years protecting his independence so fiercely that accepting love sometimes felt like surrender. Neither man was surrendering anything now. When the song ended, Brad did not hold Gabe on the floor for applause. He let him go, took his hand, and walked with him toward the side of the pavilion while the next couples moved in. Esh met them halfway. That was subtle. "I walked across a room," Brad said. "You walked past 3 women who had been preparing for that dance since June." Gabe looked at Brad. 3, 2, Brad said. 4, Wes corrected. "Go away." Wes laughed and did exactly that. Sam found Gabe a little later near the drink table. For a moment Gabe expected a serious conversation. Sam simply handed him a bottle of water. "You survived." "Barely." "Your son's heavy on his feet." "I taught him cattle, not dancing." Sam glanced toward Brad, who was being pulled into a conversation with one of the sponsors. "I worried about him with you at first." Gabe's expression changed. "Because I work catering?" "No," Sam shook his head. "Because Brad has spent his whole life being able to fix things faster than most people can explain what's wrong. He means well. That doesn't always make it easier to live with." Gabe laughed once. "He tried to buy me a refrigerator. He told me." "I told him no." "Good." Sam took a drink from his own bottle. He needed somebody who could. He looked at Gabe again, less amused now. "He's more himself when you're around. That matters to me." Gabe nodded. He did not need a formal blessing. That sentence was enough. The vendor results came the next morning. Gabe was halfway through unloading equipment when his phone rang. He listened, said, "Thank you" twice, then stood beside the trailer staring at nothing after the call ended. Brat was 20 feet away carrying a crate. Well, Gabe turned toward him slowly. We got it. Brat set the crate down. You won. I won. Brat crossed the distance in 3 strides and wrapped both arms around him. Gabe laughed into his shoulder, then caught the back of Brat's neck and kissed him before remembering they were standing in the middle of the service lot. When they separated, Brat said, "So Harding Ridge is officially one of your customers." "Correct. Boyfriend discount? You get charged extra. That feels unethical. It's a premium service fee." The contract changed Gabe's schedule almost immediately. With guaranteed events on the calendar, he signed a lease on a new commercial kitchen and financed a used trailer he could actually afford without Brat's money. Brat helped when asked. That distinction became important to both of them. He hauled equipment, tested menu items, and once spent an entire morning installing shelving because Gabe handed him a drill and told him where it went. He did not offer to buy the trailer. Gabe, for his part, stopped treating every offer of help like a threat. When he needed Brat, he asked. By early spring, Wallace Rodeo Coffee and Breakfast had its name painted across the side of the trailer. Harding Ridge became one of its first regular customers, exactly as Gabe wanted. Brat complained about the prices every time he ordered and paid them every time anyway. The new routine gave them another test neither had planned for. Time. Gabe was up before dawn on event weekends, while Brat's busiest ranch days often ended after dark. Instead of turning missed dinners into proof that something was wrong, they learned to use the hours they actually had. Brat would appear at the trailer before sunrise with his hat pulled low, drink coffee beside Gabe for 10 quiet minutes, then leave for the ranch. Gabe sometimes drove out after closing and sat on the fence while Brat finished evening checks. On one of those nights, Gabe found him repairing a gate alone under the yard lights. "You know you have employees," Gabe said. "You know you have a fiancé candidate who likes fixing things." Gabe raised an eyebrow. "Candidate?" Brat froze with the wrench in his hand. Gabe stared at him for 2 seconds, then laughed so hard he had to grab the fence. "Forget I said that. Absolutely not." Brat pointed the wrench at him. "You are impossible, and yet you keep inviting me back." Brat pulled him close by the front of his jacket and kissed him once. That part is deliberate. Moments like that made the relationship feel less like an event and more like a life. Gabe stopped measuring every kindness for hidden obligation. Brat stopped assuming every problem required his intervention. When Gabe's trailer blew a tire on the way home from a horse show, he called Brat without spending 20 minutes arguing with himself first. Brat arrived with a jack, changed the tire, accepted a coffee as payment, and never once offered to replace the whole trailer. Gabe noticed. Brat noticed that Gabe noticed. Neither needed to make a speech about it. Months later, after a long day moving cattle, Brat came into the ranch kitchen and found Gabe at the island finishing paperwork for 3 upcoming events. Gabe looked up. "You smell like a horse." "That's because I've been working." Allegedly. Brat washed his hands, opened the refrigerator, and started making sandwiches. He had improved enough in the kitchen that Gabe no longer considered breakfast a safety concern. They ate at the island with Gabe's invoices pushed to one side and Brat's ranch notes on the other. It was ordinary. That was why Brat chose that moment. He put his sandwich down. "I used to think the hard part was finding somebody who fit into the life I already had." Gabe glanced up. "That sounds suspiciously serious." "It is." Brat reached into his pocket. "Then you showed up and made me realize I wanted to build a different one." Gabe stopped moving. Brat came around the island and lowered himself onto one knee. There was no crowd, no band, no family hiding outside the door. Just the kitchen where they had eaten burnt eggs months earlier, and the 2 lives that had slowly started sharing the same space without either one disappearing inside the other. Brat opened the ring box. "Marry me." Gabe stared at the ring, then at Brat. His eyes were bright, but his mouth still found the joke first. "Please tell me that isn't the biggest ring in Wyoming." "Second biggest." "You're an idiot." "Is that a no?" Gabe grabbed the front of his shirt and pulled him up. "It's a yes." He kissed Brat before Brat could say anything else. 1 year after the night they first met, Rodeo Week returned to Harding Ridge. The fairgrounds looked much the same. Horse trailers, music, barbecue smoke, sponsor banners, cowboys and families filling the lanes. One thing had changed. Gabe's own trailer sat beside the arena with a line at the window and Wallace Rodeo coffee and breakfast printed across the side. Brad arrived after finishing ranch work and immediately reached through the service window for a piece of bacon. Gabe slapped his hand away. Paying customers only. I'm your fiancé. Then you can afford it. The last rush ended as the country band started inside the pavilion. Gabe closed the register and wiped his hands. Brad waited outside the trailer. Working, he asked. Gabe looked at the empty line, untied his apron, and hung it inside. Not anymore. Brad offered his hand. This time there was no hesitation. Gabe took it, and they walked toward the music together. A year earlier, everyone had wondered who Brad Harding would save the first dance for. Nobody needed to wonder anymore. If you enjoyed this version, the full story is available on Patreon in an extended edition running for more than an hour, with all the extra scenes, longer romantic moments, deeper chemistry, the complete raw version, and the full mature 18+ intimate scene that was shortened here for YouTube. Nothing is cut from that version. You can find the Patreon link in the description below. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.